Hi, we continue in our passage today in Luke 10:25 to 37 as we finally get to the story that Jesus tells the lawyer in response to the original question, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? So as we start, I'm going to like to go over a few things that I touched on in the introductory video, but if you hadn't watched that, these would be important to help us understand where the passage we're going to look at today, just verses 29 and 30, as you can see on the left side of your screen, fits into the larger passage and into the larger context of Luke's gospel, and further into the larger context of the synoptics, which is where we're starting on the right side of the screen, as we see that both Mark and Matthew have a similar encounter between a scribe or a lawyer and Jesus over the question of the greatest commandments. But as you can see, the color-coded parts are the parts that are parallel, but all the part we're looking at starting today is unique to Luke, and it's very unique to Luke, as we'll see. But part of what Luke does is parallel it on the chiastic other side of the Luke travel narrative in chapter 18 with a certain ruler asking him the identical question, although titling it as good teacher rather than just teacher, as the lawyer does in our passage today. And so you can see there are parallels there, and that's part of Luke's bigger pattern of how the travel narrative really is showing the entire course of discipleship for anybody who wants to follow, whether those are disciples already called disciples like the 12 or the 70, or the women who in chapter 8 we were told were following and providing for Jesus, but also the crowd and anybody else like this lawyer or like the ruler or anybody who would like to follow. We also look briefly at how the two halves of our current passage are parallel. The first part where the lawyer asks the question and Jesus responds to the question with the Shema and Leviticus 19:8, and then now we have the second half wanting to justify himself. So the lawyer has two questions: what must I do to inherit eternal life, and who is my neighbor? But now we're told in both cases his inner motivation, first to test Jesus and now to justify himself. So we're going to have to look at what that means, and we will more momentarily. Also, we touched on all the characters in this scene, many of whom need some further elucidation to understand who they are. So last time we looked at the lawyer, and of course we've been looking at the question of the disciples, the 12 and the 70 throughout. But we looked at the role of lawyers. Today we're going to look at the question of neighbors and the naked half-dead man of Jerusalem road, and robbers or bandits. Next time we'll look at priests and Levites and Samaritans. And as we enter into this passage, as I was noting, this is uniquely Lucan, but it's really especially uniquely Lucan. So you can see in just these 6 verses how many words that Luke uses that are either unique in the New Testament or only in the New Testament 1 or 2 places, or occasionally, like here, only here in the entire Greek Bible and only one other time in the entire Greek Bible in a very late text. So some of these words, because they're used so rarely, it's not 100% clear what they mean in the Greco-Roman context, but we're going to look at those as we go, especially in a couple of videos from now when we look at inns and innkeepers. But even now, as you look into the question of fell into the hands of, etc. And so as we begin our story today, our passage today, wanting to justify himself. So let's look briefly at the word here, dikaio, in Luke and in the wider Septuagint, because plainly the lawyer and the narrator speaking on his behalf is considering what the word meant not in Luke and the New Testament, but what it meant in the tradition that he inherited, which Jesus had just asked him, how do you read it? So the question of how do you read was plainly about neighbor, but the justify is also a question of how do you read implicitly because of his internal thought. So let's look at that briefly. So we see in Luke earlier that it was used to acknowledge the justice of God. So that's one term. And then wisdom is vindicated by her children. Here's our current passage. Later he will speak to opponents, you are those who justify yourselves. So that's parallel to trying to justify himself here in the sight of others. But God knows your hearts. And we'll come to that one later. But let's keep that in mind here on the question of justifying yourself. Jesus' point later, which certainly applies back now, is that God knows the heart. This is a man who's not looking for a sincere answer. He's not really trying to be obedient to God or to follow Jesus. He's trying to get out of the honor-shame trap that Jesus has now put him in by turning the question back on him. And then later in Luke, we'll hear the contrast between a Pharisee and a poor man, both of whom are offering a prayer, and it'll be the poor man whom Jesus says went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, etc. And then we'll see one example in Acts, although it's translated differently, as we see, to be set free in the sense of liberation. This is Paul speaking in chapter 13. So let's look back at a few examples. There are 52 uses of the term in the Septuagint, and I note in my note here that it's rare in the Pentateuch and it's rare in the Deuteronomistic history as well, which are the books from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. Only 3 times or 4 times total in the Pentateuch, and Deuteronomy as a book overlaps. It's part of the Pentateuch, but it's also the beginning of the Deuteronomistic history. And they're only once in 2 Samuel and once in Kings, contrasting with 11 times in the late text of Sirach and 8 times in the Psalms of Solomon, which isn't in almost anybody's Bible, but is going to be important, as we'll see, and has already been important in Luke's composition. There's not that much from the earlier part of the Septuagint, and that's interesting in terms of it is not within the legal part. It's a legal term, and as we can see from some of the Septuagint uses, means primarily a sense of being declared innocent or guilty in some kind of trial or some kind of hearing, whether that's before God in the format of a supposed trial or among humans as well. Let's look at just a few examples of the 52. And I picked this one from Ezekiel because it includes Samaria. And maybe that's coincidental or maybe it's not, but it comes right after the passage where Ezekiel is comparing the sins of Jerusalem to the sins of Sodom, and the sins of Sodom are described as they had an abundance of wealth, but they would not share it with the poor. So the sin of Sodom is not what we think of as sodomy, but lack of hospitality. And now it turns to Samaria as another comparison to Jerusalem. The you here, or yours, is Jerusalem, and yet what's happening here is that Jerusalem makes your sister cities, which includes Samaria and Sodom, appear righteous or innocent or just by comparison. But in the end, what Yahweh is saying through Ezekiel here is, I will restore their fortunes, the fortunes of Sodom and her daughters, and the fortunes of Samaria and her daughters, and I will restore your own fortunes along with theirs, which is to highlight in the post-exilic, or actually exilic vision of Ezekiel for the post-exilic community. He sees Yahweh's will as restoring Samaria and Sodom along with Jerusalem. So there's no sense that Samaria is anything foreign at all, and that'll be important in the next video when we look at who the Samaritans are. Putting aside the Samaria question, we can see how the word is translated other contexts in Isaiah, and it's used a number of times in Isaiah, here in the sense of pleading for the widow, which is to say, asking for justice on behalf of the widow. Interestingly, the widow in Luke's gospel later, who seeks justice from the judge, is not recorded using that particular word. In a classic passage from Micah, which is the do justice and walk humbly before your God passage, one of the charges is that can I tolerate, that's Yahweh speaking, of course, a bag of dishonest weights. So it's used here as dishonest. In the Psalm, and it's a number of Psalms, we hear that sense of personal innocence. And then in Sirach, a number of these late ones, unrighteous anger cannot be justified. That use of justified is much more in the sense of the way we would use justified perhaps in our cultural context today, in the sense of giving an explanation for why something is okay. But most of these others, it has to do with innocence or guilt, having been found by somebody else to be innocent or guilty. And that's certainly the case in our passage today, where the lawyer wants to justify himself in the sight of others. And that echoes into the passage we saw about the use of the word back up here, you who justify yourselves in the sight of others. So that's a little context for that word. And he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And neighbor here is plesion here, but neighbor has several issues we need to look at as well. So as you can see from this chart, neighbor in English translates 3 different Greek words in Luke Acts. Plesion as here, but only here. 3 times in this passage we see plesion, and we'll see how that's found in the Septuagint in just a minute. And also 1 time in Acts. But what we see for plesion that echoes into our passage is this one from Exodus, where it's used, interestingly, for fellow Hebrew, not for neighbor in the sense of someone who lives next to you, but someone who's part of your community. And that's key here, because that's the inference that we're talking about, in contrast to other meanings of neighbor, simply someone who happens to live next door to you. But who is part of the us that you consider to be us? Later in Exodus, we see the same thing in the 10 Commandments, and it's echoed identically into the Deuteronomy version of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. So all these things you shall not do, which is to honor the integrity of the other people in your community, not to bear false witness against them or covet any of their things. So in that sense, neighbor means everybody who's part of the covenant community. And the immediate passage of Leviticus 19, which is the love your neighbor as yourself passage, as you see at the bottom, I included the whole passage here so you could see other elements of what you're not to do to a neighbor. And here, one another is also translating neighbor, the same word plesion. You shall not lie to one another, which is, of course, the same as not bearing false witness, and not defraud, and not judge, and not profit by the blood of your neighbor, but you shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt in yourself. And that comes up also in an echo into Luke's gospel that we'll see much later. After all these negative ones, then there's a positive one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So all these elements are something that the lawyer should know as illustrations of a loving neighbor. But his question isn't, how do I love my neighbor? The question is, who is my neighbor? And that shouldn't really be a question, because the issue of neighbor meant everybody who was part of the covenanted community. And so Jesus could simply say as a response, your neighbor are all the people that are part of Yahweh's covenanted community. You call them Israelites or Judahites or whatever you might want to say. But instead, with no further ado, he tells a story. Before we get to the story, let's look at the two other words that are translated neighbor in Luke so we can see the differences. So giton here is 16 times in the Septuagint, 4 in the New Testament, but only John 8 outside of Luke. So we have these 3 times in Luke and then only John 8 there, where the neighbors come to the person who'd been born blind and wonder if he's the right person. In that situation, it's expected that as neighbors, they would recognize him, someone they'd seen around. So we will see in Luke 14 the question of when you give a banquet, don't invite your rich neighbors. And then in the next chapter, similarly, someone else, these are in the lost sequences here, and 6 and 9 are two repeated frames for the lost story, the 3 lost stories of the coin, the sheep, and then the son, calls together friends and neighbors, and she calls together friends and neighbors. So notice the distinction between friends and neighbors. And in this sense, neither of these necessarily imply a covenanted community. These could be people that aren't quote-unquote Jews or Israelites, and certainly speaking to his audience, when you give a luncheon, these people are almost certainly not Jews, but are Greco-Romans, and as I've been trying to argue throughout, young Romans who are about to take their place as members of the elite. So they certainly would not see neighbors in the sense of members of a covenanted community. They might see neighbors in the sense of Roman citizens, but that's not the approach he presents here. He's speaking of rich neighbors. He turns this into a question of class rather than a question of group identity. And similarly here, the neighbors are just simply part of the gathering of those who rejoice. But neither the person who found what was lost seems to owe any obligation to those people other than to call them to rejoice with them. The final one, which is only one time in Luke, and we heard it early on here, her neighbors and relatives, and that's about Elizabeth. And here, periakoi literally means around, those who are around. Oikio from oikos, house, and peri for around. So literally what we think of as neighbors, people in the surrounding houses. And that's why it's referred to otherwise as simply inhabitants of a location or neighboring regions. Those in the geographic area. So this is a word referring more to geography. This is a word referring to social contexts that don't necessarily involve geography or ethnic identity. And this one is the one who are part of your group. And notice these are all applying specifically to people who are members of the covenant community. So much for verse 29. And now we turn to verse 30, where Jesus replies here. As the term translated here as reply could also be suppose. And my note below highlighting what I was just saying, this is never named a parable. So we're so used to saying the parable of the Good Samaritan, but it's not a parable. And that's really important, because a parable suggests that a story is about something other than the immediate situation it's about. Whether we hear that allegorically or as a simile, that the story itself is meant to be translated into something else. But this is simply a direct story. So although both early Christian writers who allegorized scripture left and right, they never took anything literally until Augustine in the 4th century played with that a little bit. But certainly in the Alexandrian tradition, where Philo had taught Platonic and other philosophers who became Christians how to interpret, this was read allegorically. Sometimes modern scholars tend to still read it allegorically, but I want to suggest that that's a way of reading that is suggested by Luke not to follow here, because the story is not a parable. It's simply a story about the thing that happens. So that's why we need to pay really close attention to the details of what it says. And although the translation says a man, it's an anthropos. It could be a woman in theory, although the verbs are male plural verbs, and it certainly suggests a male, but at first it's simply a person. And as Green notes below, a powerful rhetorical move on Jesus' part and the impossibility of classifying this person as either friend or foe. And he was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he had been to Jerusalem, presumably for a feast, which is not named, and now he's going to Jericho. And we can look at that both on the Bible Atlas map, and we can see Jerusalem here and down to Jericho. As scholars note, this is not the historical Jericho, which is one of the oldest cities that we have archaeological remains for, some 8,000 years or more old. This is a city built by Herod in this time period. So this road here, which you can now see in the Google Maps version, which I showed in the introductory video, the roughly 38 kilometers and how long it would take by foot to go there. And I also showed the introductory video this close-up, so you can see how the road does curve in a way that people who are thieves or laysdays, as we'll see, could be hiding behind a curve and pounce on somebody like we have in the story here. So going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers. And this is the first of the words that are rare words in this thing, parapipto, and it was once in Acts and once in James, but this is what it means, to fall under somebody else's control. So that's what's key here. This man is going down, and he falls under the control of laysdays. And they're translated robbers here, but that's almost certainly a misleading, if incorrect, translation. Sometimes it's translated as thieves, as often it's understood on the cross here, the person next to Jesus as the, quote, good thief. But thieves were not punished by crucifixion. So we need to look more closely at what's going on here. It's not used enough times in the New Testament or in the Septuagint to get any more detailed understanding of it from context. But we can get some sense from the Greek lexicons, which explore its usage in all extant Greek literature, not just in the biblical text. So here we get from the Liddell Scott lexicon this definition as a robber, pirate, or buccaneer. And the example you see there, he began a course of piracies upon them. So from that we can hear it's about organized robbery, organized theft, and it leads people like Richard Horsley, who's been working on this theme for almost 40 years now, maybe it is 40 years now, to describe these as quote-unquote social bandits, much akin to Robin Hood and his merry men, who can easily be romanticized, but plainly were violent, but they were violent on behalf of their fellow poor people who'd been exploited by the empire, by, in that case, the English Empire, and of course the famous Sheriff of Nottingham. We don't know enough about laysdays to know whether they redistributed the wealth that they got by theft to people around them, but that's certainly the suggestion within Horsley's view, and even the dictionary, the lexicon definition suggests they're at least part of a group who understand some kind of solidarity together. So we don't know how many of them were here. It's simply plural. Is it 2 or is it 10? But he plainly has no chance. And what's described, the first thing they do is take off his clothes. And again, a unique word here in Luke. It's used for Jesus when they strip him of his clothes. So it's not one of the words that's as rare as others, but it's only here in Luke. And many scholars have noted that means that the person could be seen as a Jew or not, whether he was circumcised, but it depends on whether he's lying face up or face down. In the picture that I started as a cover on this that I showed last time, and I'll put it up again as you can see here, plainly he's face down and you can't tell, and maybe that's because the artist didn't want to show a naked man face up, but others do with at least a little cloth of some kind over his genitals, which would be the same as having him closed. You still couldn't see whether he is circumcised, and we can't quite imagine someone pulling that piece of cloth off someone who appears to be dead to find out whether his penis has a foreskin or not. So they don't know the ethnic nature of this person. He's just somebody there. Now, anybody coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho would almost certainly be understood as somebody pious, but many Gentiles went to the temple for various things, whether that's for commerce or, as many people had described them, as God-fearers, as people who recognized Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, as the one true God, but hadn't chosen to sign up for men by circumcision or to join the community. So it's possible there would be people like that. But as we'll see when we get to the Samaritan, who's also on the road, perhaps it was just people doing business. We certainly know there's a court of the Gentiles around the temple, and there are, of course, famously money changers who certainly didn't live all year round in the temple and must have come up and down for festivals and things and gone back down to Jericho. So all we know is that this man is left naked there, and after stripping him, him, which presumably because his clothing was valuable, whether it's linen or silk, or we don't know, but that would still be of some value, they beat him. And we will see beating again in chapter 12, and as well as this passage. And they went away, leaving him half dead. And that's key here. That's only one other time, and as I noted in fourth Maccabees, but many scholars make the mistake when we get to the priest and Levite, bring up legal provisions about touching a dead body or a corpse. But Luke specifies this is not a corpse. He's half dead. And Bailey notes in my note below that this is in the rabbinic category, meaning next to death, but plainly not actually dead. And there's no rule, certainly in the Torah, against touching somebody who's injured and could be brought back to life. In any event, they could have tested to see whether he was breathing or not, but they don't. They pass by on the other side, as we'll see next time. So this is the picture that Jesus painted for the lawyer here. And I just want to summarize that briefly before we get to the three options of how people respond. This is suggesting that this road is dangerous, that going up to Jerusalem and coming back down is risking your life, that anybody who's going up that road or down it could be risking their life, especially on the way back, as it seems here. And there are people who are disaffected who are also on that road, these lay stays. Whether they hang out on that road or they hang out in Jericho and show up on that road once in a while, we don't know. But this is all addressing the question of who is my neighbor. And we'll see in the next video the response of several that help highlight the question, not of who is a neighbor, but what it means to be a neighbor to others. Because we'll pick up that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.